all of a sudden acquaintances and friends started just disappearing, literally disappearing. They were there one day and gone the next. And then you would hear a rumor, oh, they got caught in the golf course, kind of. They were making out with another woman. That would be the rumor. So you never knew officially why they disappeared. You'd always get this rumor. And so none of the staff or military higher of the military told you what happened to them. But you started, that gave a direct sense that you started having to be very careful about what you did with other women if you're a woman.
The 1970 report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada included 167 recommendations for reducing gender inequality throughout Canadian society, including Canada's military. Back then, according to the report, Canada had about 1,600 women in its armed forces, just 1.6% of the total strength. Women were employed in a small number of trades, most of them administrative, technical, or in paramedical fields. Prior to 1970 in Canada, homosexuality was a criminal offense under the Criminal Code, and the Special Investigations Unit, or SIU, conducted their military investigations as criminal investigations. After 1970, when homosexual activity between consenting adults was no longer considered a criminal offense, homosexuality was considered as an administrative problem by the Canadian Forces, and SIU investigations were then conducted as administrative investigations.
I would say about 6 months into the relationship, I'm not sure exactly, she was called in for the investigation, and she told him yes, that we were in a relationship, and by then it was no more hiding.
In fact, a late 1969 memo from Canada's top bureaucrat to the heads of all federal departments and agencies read, quote, "The following factors should be emphasized. Except for private acts between consenting adults, homosexuality in Canada is an offense under the Criminal Code," unquote. Hello and welcome to Queer Legends, an oral history podcast. I'm your host, Sean Dern. Season 2 of Queer Legends is supported in part by a community grant from the LGBT Purge Fund. The 1970s was a time of massive social change in Canada. It included the queer sexual revolution, the FLQ crisis, which led to political kidnappings, and the assassination of a Quebec cabinet minister. At the urging of Quebec's premier and Montreal's mayor, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau used the War Measures Act to restore order with soldiers in the streets, and it resulted in many unlawful arrests across Canada by overzealous police officers. In the spring of 1971, the Gay Alliance Towards Equality, or GATE, was formed. It was one of the first Canadian gay liberation groups. In July that summer, Everett Clippert was finally released from prison. A month later, on the 28th of August 1971, a young Charlie Hill found himself at the center of Canada's first well-organized gay and lesbian rights protest, which delivered the We Demand Manifesto.
According to what I've read, and my memory's not always good on this, was I was not supposed to speak. Somebody else was supposed to speak, but their car rolled on the way up to Ottawa. And so that I was asked to speak, and I said, yes, I would.
Canadian homosexuals are having their careers ruined, being kicked out of their churches, having their children taken away from them, and being assaulted in the streets of our own city. What have we done to deserve this? Love, that's all we have done. All we want to do is love persons of the same sex and live our lives as we decide for ourselves. We're fed up with the lack of basic respect due all human beings.
The demonstration on the Hill, I think, was retrospectively very important, but it was not a catalyst in my own life, because I had been giving talks at high schools and various places, and so that it was just one more. And yes, we were all concerned about being on the Hill. It was about, obviously, an important focus tactically. It was organized from Toronto, and the people there really wanted to, had thought it through and written a very good speech. And but we had a very small audience. It was pouring rain. There weren't a lot of people. There was certainly a number of RCMP around and a certain number of journalists. And but we didn't have a big audience. So, I think it was a bit of sort of street theater in a void. But because it was filmed and because it got published in the press, that became the audience.
The homosexuals are demanding such things as an end to discrimination in the Immigration Act, equal right to government employment, including the armed forces, an end to homosexuality as grounds for divorce, and in divorce, equal right to child custody.
The demonstration, as I say, it really was a bit of an avoid, but I think it was important. nonetheless, because we were placing our demands right at the seat of the federal government.
Gay is proud. Gay is good. Let's say it wherever we go. Gay power.
What's interesting about being involved in the movement are the people who do not get involved, who are watching you nonetheless. And you can't really evaluate the influence you're having on people like that, but I still think there was a lot of influence. Certainly there were people who didn't want to have anything to do with us, that we were more of a threat to them than straight people.
Shortly after the We Demand protest, the RCMP began looking into creation of its first common computer databases, accessible to officers across Canada. The database would go on to be used extensively for the RCMP queer witch hunt. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association stopped listing homosexuality as a mental disorder, and in 1973-74, a young Gary Bennett was a new recruit in the Canadian Forces, and he was already openly gay. Gary's the son of a 1950s unwed teen mom and a man nearly twice her age who was already married with 4 kids. Gary was placed in a loving foster family at birth and kept a secret by his biological mother. At 16, his life was thrown into chaos when his foster father died. Gary had to move in with a former foster brother to finish high school when his foster mom sold everything and moved across the country to live with biological relatives. Gary joined the military after a short-lived attempt at working full-time and carrying a full university course load with no family or other supports. Once in the military, he and some friends got approved to live in base housing, which was an apartment in a fourplex. Life was good, until...
There was a gentleman that lived on the first ground floor, and I was friends with him. I have no idea whether he was straight or gay, but I suspect he may have been gay. He worked in the military police office, and he told me one day that when we were chatting that I should be very careful that my name had come up in an investigation and that I was being investigated and that I was being followed. And so given that information from that day on, I became straight. There was no gay activities. I didn't meet with anyone that was known to be gay. I didn't go to gay bars. I gave absolutely nothing to the armed forces that would indicate that I was gay. And I did start to notice that I'd look out in the window in the morning and there'd be a car sitting out there, and wherever I went there seemed to be a car nearby. And that's how I actually found out about that I was under investigation.
Gary Bennett took every precaution not to give anyone a reason to suspect that he was an out and proud gay man off the military base. Despite putting on a straight face, it turns out that someone already under homosexual investigation by the SIU pointed a finger at Gary.
Not that long after, I was called in, and I'm not 100% sure, but I believe I was brought in twice. But I'm having a hard time trying to remember what happened the second time. But the first time I definitely remember there were 2 people, two men, who interviewed me, and I remember it taking the form of good cop, bad cop. You know, pretty much like you see on TV. One tries to be your friend, the other one's wants to put you away for life, kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that I remember being told. Well, you know, if you tell us everyone that you know in the forces that's gay, that's okay. You'll get to stay in, and you can leave, and your career will go on. And of course, you're scared because you don't know what's happened. You know, you're 22, 23, whatever I was at the time, and you are trying to save your career. You're trying to save your life because you don't know what they know, and you don't know what kind of power that they have, or what their actual intention is.
Gary said he doesn't remember much of what was said that day. He had put it all out of his mind until he was called before his commanding officer and told he was being let go from the military for being a homosexual. It was effective almost immediately, but he was then offered a 3-month contract to work as a civilian in the same office.
And that was a difficult decision to make, because I sort of wondered initially, well, I'm not good enough to sit on this side of the office and do inventory control activities in a uniform. However, I am okay to sit on this side of the office in civilian clothes doing other inventory control duties. And that confused me, and I wondered, did everyone in that office know what was going on? I let on that my 2 years of service was up and I was electing to leave. I guess in some respects I felt that I was unworthy, that I had been betrayed by my family, and where was I going to go? I had no family to go back to in Nova Scotia. I had absolutely no one. Where was I going to go? What was I going to do? How was I going to live? What would my life be like when part of my life dream was to be in the armed forces and become eventually an officer.
Remember, this happened to Gary when he was 21 or 22 years old. He said he was a frightened kid who had no clue what to do next.
There was no trial. You were not given any legal counsel. You had no choice. It was them telling you you were gone, and you had absolutely no recourse. No, what's fair about that?
Gary finished the civilian contract the military offered him, and then he was out. Luckily, a friend in Toronto offered him a place to stay and helped him find a temp contract. Unlike many purge survivors, Gary found full-time employment and was able to move on with his life at what was then called Ontario Hydro, despite what the military had done to him. In 1975, the United States government announced their policy of exclusion of gays was over and withdrew the so-called immoral conduct criteria from their hiring process. The U.S. military was exempted, of course, and continued its ban on gays and lesbians. Around this same time, the RCMP was still stinging from its handling of the FLQ crisis, and in preparation for the 1976 Montreal Olympics, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau appointed the RCMP's first French-Canadian commissioner, Maurice Jean Nadon. According to the RCMP's website, Commissioner Nadon emphasized a war against organized crime, introduced female and married personnel into the ranks, and led operations through the Montreal Olympics. Now you may be asking yourself, what did the 1976 Montreal Olympics have to do with Canada's queer witch hunts? To explain, I'm pleased to be joined by Gary Kinsman. Gary retired as Professor Emeritus from Laurentian University. He is a renowned queer activist, author of The Regulation of Desire, now out in its 3rd edition, and co-author with Patrizia Gentili, whom you've heard from in earlier episodes, of the Canadian War on Queers, National Security is Sexual Regulation.
That actually led to the escalation of sexual policing, especially of men who had sex with men, in the 1970s. And as our communities, our networks became more public and visible, the police noticed this, and we became more and more of a problem. Which is why you actually have the escalation of, the raid on trucks, the raid on gay bathhouses in Toronto and Ottawa and other places developing. But part of what went on was that around the Summer Olympics in 1976 in Montreal, there was an attempt to, quote, clean up the city, right? And obviously that had a major impact on unhoused people and all sorts of people on the streets, right? But it also had a particular impact on, we need to get rid of the queers. So the queers were seen still as a national security problem, but also as a particular type of policing problem.
And kind of a public embarrassment, too, for the government, right? Like, they're rolling out the red carpet to the world, and they're like, oh, we don't want you to see those people.
Yeah, and they don't want gays and lesbians. And I mean, there are important mobilizations against lesbian bars that go on as part of the cleanup campaign. So what happens in the lead up to the 76 Summer Olympics is you have all of the different police departments, like in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, intersecting with the RCMP's campaign to try to clean up not just gay and lesbian activists, but gay and lesbian establishments. So at one point in time in Montreal, almost every single gay institution is actually closed down. And
all the bathhouses, most of the bars, everything.
Yeah. There's a raid also on the club baths in Ottawa.
The Ottawa bathhouse raid was particularly interesting in that it was the first of its kind in that city. I mean, Montreal had already had tons, Toronto had had a bunch, but in Ottawa, this was the first one of its kind, and then they also took the membership list, which had about 3,000 names or something like that, right?
And that was a major concern that was raised.
On May 22nd, 1976, 27 men were arrested at the Club Baths located at 1069 Wellington Street West in Ottawa. 22 were charged as found-ins, 2 with gross indecency, and 3 as being keepers. The membership list was later returned, but presumably police kept records of the names on the list. There was a significant protest against the raid afterwards at Ottawa Police Headquarters. The bathhouse, under a different name, continues to operate at the same location and is likely deserving of a heritage designation of some kind. Also in 1976, 18-year-old Lynn Golliker joined the military. Lynn now lives in Sudbury and is a professor at Laurentian University. She spent 16 years in the Canadian Armed Forces and even longer researching the impacts of the LGBT purge on survivors. Her work was important to the eventual class action lawsuit and influenced the government's apology. But 18-year-old Lynn had been out of school for about a year and was looking for work. She enjoyed farming, driving large vehicles, loved to fire guns, and to do a bit of hunting. So Lynn applied to the military and to a Northern Ontario mining company, and the military accepted her first.
Well, once you get into basic training and they start, throwing you into, there is a lot of orders. That's the primary purpose, and that's what they were training and building you up to, is to listen, react, and obey kind of idea, and listen to the orders. You could get singled out, yes, if something, if you fell down or you stumbled even, they would call you out in the sense, we were training at that time by gender. So in Cornwallis, Canadian Forces Base Cornwallis was the training base at that time, and women trained separately from men. And so you had all women's platoons. Usually they started at about 50, 60 people in the platoons, and you would end up with 30, 40 that would graduate in the end after basic training, because it is a very physically demanding and stressful. So and that can amount to a lot of physical and mental stress put on you. So people would either get hurt or it'd be too much for them at that time, and they would quit along the way.
None of that mattered to Diane Pitre of northern New Brunswick. Being in the military was her dream. As a young child, she had 2 uncles who were in the military, one in the Second World War, and one was a Korean War veteran who became a peacekeeper. Diane admired them, and they were all she talked about. So she finished high school and joined the forces in November 1977.
This is where I want to be. This is where I am. I didn't know if I was gay. Never even thought about it. I didn't even think about guys. I just wanted to be there and serve my country. It was like, this drive, like go. That's me.
So how was it when you were starting your career? What was it like working with the other guys? I'm assuming you were not a lot of women either where you were.
When I finished my course, I was posted to CFB Chatham, which is now called Miramichi, 416 Squadron. It was great. It's hard to explain the feeling. All of a sudden, you're out there on the flight line, and all these planes are landing. But being a woman, we did the little jobs of, changing the brakes or changing the tires, and the guys would make jokes about, it's heavy. We're not going to help you with that. Do it yourself. And I'm like, I'm not going to ask you. So, but it was great. We were 2 women at the time. There was a couple of in safety, but and there was one aero engine. But as airframe, we were 2.
So just being a woman in the forces at that time, those were the early days of women really being in these types of jobs too. Did you feel like there was a lot of extra pressure on you? There
wasn't that much pressure. The only thing that was disappointing is that we didn't get to do much of what the guys did. It was, I fueled more aircrafts than I ever repaired one as an airframe. I changed more tires. We did, So it was a bit disappointing. I remember one day going to lunch and they had this poster up there for skydiving. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to do this. So I went over and, oh no, this is for the guys. So we were limited to what we could do.
Women were forbidden from serving in combat arms and at sea. Married women weren't even allowed to join. The Royal Commission's recommendation was to open all trades in the military to women. Lynn Gulliker says not much changed after the report on the status of women in Canada. Women continued to have fewer opportunities to enter and advance in government service, and their skills and abilities were not being fully used. And as the report said, attitudes and practices seemed to be at fault. Occupational segregation by gender continued, and proportionately fewer women than men were being trained to the full extent of their potential or being promoted to senior levels.
So this was the first time where you're housed separately. You do a lot of your training. There was some of it, some of the classes, and I'll say that some of the classes were you learning about basic military information, books, and that. They would have some of it mixed, but usually it was just separate. And all of your physical, your PT, physical training, and that was separate. So you were never in competition with the guys. I found it just fantastic that it was like all women, and you live with them, you talked with them, and you went out and did all of these great things that you've never done in your life before. So it was great that way. It was a wonderful gendered experience, and I think they should still have it for women.
By this point, it's been about 7 years since the Status of Women report, and little was changing. In fact, the only jurisdiction in Canada where sexual orientation was a prohibited ground of discrimination was Quebec, which had just added it to its own newly minted Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Ottawa, Cabinet Directive 35 was still in place to keep homosexuals out of sensitive government jobs. The RCMP continued its queer witch hunt, while simultaneously encouraging Pierre Trudeau's government to double down on the policy and not cave to changing public attitudes towards gays and lesbians. And Canadian Forces Administrative Order 1920 was still purging amazing soldiers like Pt.4 from her life's dream.
Well, when I was in board and doing my training, I met this young girl and didn't realize that I was attracted to her. And so we had this relationship, and it wasn't for long because I was posted to Chatham. And I'd been there 77, 78, about 6 months, I would say. And I was called over and told to go to Halifax. So I wasn't quite sure why I was going to Halifax. I was just saying somebody will meet you at the airport.
Oh, they just told you you're going and you'll be met there. This wasn't like, oh, you're getting a new posting. It was, we need you to go.
No. Tomorrow morning, or in the afternoon, you're going to Halifax. Not where in Halifax, you're going to be picked up. So I took the plane, I went, full uniform, and these two guys showed up at the airport. And Private Petrie, and I said, yes. She said, we're here to pick you up, and I said, okay. So I just got into this car. They're famous K cars. You must have heard a lot about them.
I have heard about the K cars, yes.
Oh, the K cars, nice car. So I'm sitting in the back seat, and we're driving, and I don't know if you're familiar with Halifax, but it's like in a wooded area. And we drove and we drove and we drove forever until we got into this industrial place. But I was afraid at one point. I said, what if I got into the wrong car? Well, I have my name here, so I don't know. But we got to this place and they told me to get out. And
How long do you figure you were driving for before you stopped? And were they talking to you at all?
No. I would say almost an hour, the drive. And I'm just like thinking of everything negative about being in that car because they don't talk. I'm not talking. I'm not much of a talker. And I don't know what's going on until we get to this thing and I'm sitting down there and there's a table and one chair. I sit there and then these...
Was it a military base they took you up to?
I have no idea. I got there, it was dark. And
so you arrive there, it's dark, you then get piled into a car, you drive in silence for an hour, and you arrive at some place. Are you in handcuffs or anything, or are you just sitting in the back going...
No, just sitting in the Oh, I'm thinking every worst possible thing that could be happening. I watch too much TV, I think. But they sit me down in this little room, and one guy has long hair, and one is very clean cut. And then he told to me, he said, "I'm Sergeant," I can't remember his name, and it was Master Corporal, I can't remember his name. He said, "We're military police, known as SIU, and we're here to question you." And oddly enough, what pops into my mind, my uncle saying to me when I left, "If you want to be a peacekeeper, if you're ever stopped or taken prisoner, don't ever talk. If they're asking you a question, you don't betray your country." And I'm like, okay. So naively, they start asking me questions. I'm not going to answer what they're asking. I think it's a test. And then they come out, "We heard you were a lesbian." Nope. I'm not going to talk because and that lasted till, I would say, it must have been 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And we got back into the car, and they dropped me up at CFB Halifax in the psych ward. And the next morning, I met with the psychologist, and then they picked me up again, and we did the investigation all over again for about 3-4 days. I forget the time frame at the time.
And by the way, was this the same people, the people who drove you there, were they the ones who questioned you?
Yes.
And so this was like a repeat, happened every day for a few days, same people, same questions?
Same question, a little bit more serious, sort of. Not, we heard it's, "You are a lesbian. What do you do when you're with a woman?" A stupid question.
Really personal questions, right?
Yeah, personal question like, "Do you masturbate in front of a mirror? Are you the man of the relationship?" And I'm saying I have no relationship. I'm working in CFB Chatham. I don't have a relationship. And you just kept after it. And then they, on the last day, they said, "You want to take a polygraph test?" And I said, "Sure." And then I took the test. Whether it was the truth that they told me, but they said the test revealed that you were homosexual. And I kept denying it.
Wait a minute. They said the test said you were homosexual, or did they say that you lied about being a homosexual?
No, they said that it revealed that I wasn't homosexual. I can't remember the exact word because this is like 1978. But they said according to the polygraph that I was a homosexual, and I said that I wasn't. So the next day, they shipped me back to Chatham. And my major called me into his office, and he said, you were accused and test revealed you're homosexual, but he said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Just leave it up to me, don't worry about it." So I went back to work, and a couple of days after, he called me in, and he said that unfortunately I could stay in the military, but I had lost my security clearance because it was top secret, and I would be retrained in supply as a supply technician. So I went back to Borden. But he told me, he said, my new major, he said, "Whatever you do, you keep your nose clean, you're doing your job, and just stay away from trouble."
And by keeping your nose clean and staying away from trouble, he was saying, stop messing around with women?
Well, to me, I took it with people altogether, so I just stayed by myself.
So while Diane put herself into a kind of isolation, I asked Lynn Golliker about her own experience.
The first time I started realizing that homosexuality wasn't welcome in the Canadian Armed Forces was in basic trades training, which was right after boot camp. So that would have been in Borden, CFB Borden. And there, and I'm talking specifically about women. I didn't know much of who was what, but all of a sudden acquaintances and friends started just disappearing. Literally disappearing. They were there one day and gone the next. And then you would hear a rumor, oh, they got caught in the golf course, kind of. They were making out with another woman. That would be the rumor. So you never knew officially why they disappeared. You'd always get this rumor. And so none of the staff or military hierarchy of the military told you what happened to them. But you started, that gave a direct sense that you started having to be very careful about what you did with other women if you're a woman. And probably, I didn't hang out with the guys that much, but if they were a gay man, that would probably have been the same.
At any point, did you or other folks you knew discover what had happened to these friends? Like, they disappeared, but were there any rumors that started to circulate perhaps about the interrogations or violence or anything? Or was it just blink, they were gone and everyone sort of going, what the hell just happened?
I don't remember the source of the rumors, but it was talked about because we were in barracks. There was like 4 to a room. Again, it was all women's barracks. It's not sort of like what you can imagine today. Oftentimes you got your own room with a kitchenette and stuff like that. No, you have a barracks, long corridors, 4 to a room, all women, and there's a washroom down the hallway, and then you have to go and eat in another building somewhere else. So still, you still have that very rigid gender split. Men and women weren't supposed to be in each other's barracks. You couldn't go in them, so they were keeping everybody separate in terms of the genders, the traditional genders is what I'll call them. But I do remember in trades training and this happening and these rumors being there and sort of knowing that you couldn't act in a certain way. And I do remember people talking to me, just having fun and laying on the same bed with another roommate, and then people saying, be careful because this could be misinterpreted. So I do have that memory of that if you got physically or somehow too close to another woman, people could misinterpret it, and that would not go with. That meant be careful and don't do it again.
Really? So even simple camaraderie would begin to get everyone bristly?
It wasn't a sense of don't do that or I'll tell on you. It was you better be careful. So it was like almost a concern.
I won't tell, but someone else might.
Yeah, you shouldn't be caught. You shouldn't be seen. You should keep everything hidden. Kind of idea, protect yourself.
How many years is this after you got in?
Oh, this is very short. Like boot camp is, I'll say, 3 months.
Oh, so you're still at this point, you're still like 18, 19, okay.
You're green, yeah, 19. You're very green. You're just still learning how to walk and talk as a toddler in the military lifestyle. And you're just learning how to do the trade that you picked and that. So I was in Borden. I was air weapons technician, so I was learning something about aircrafts and something about the weapons on the aircraft. And it was a non-traditional job. I didn't want the traditional work. I tried to pick as close to guns as I could get, and the infantry was closed. So, and for some reason, I didn't pick weapons land, which is the armors. Maybe I thought it was cool to be Air Force. Lucky me, though. I'm very lucky to have picked that.
Why is that?
Well, to this day, the Army is still the most traditional part of the overall Canadian Armed Forces, with gender or sexualities, gender identities, and non-heterosexualities.
Unfortunately, that straight male mentality put a lot of women soldiers into real danger.
So if you sexually assault a woman, you can get away with it. If you sexually harass a woman, especially in the time that I was in, the language, the pinups, everything, it's like that was just normal, and it was not seen as breaking the law, the military laws. There was no law that said a man couldn't sexually assault a woman in the Canadian Armed Forces, so they weren't breaking a military law. That didn't come in until the 90s. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I don't want to laugh at this.
Do you know what else was not a laughing matter? Straight military men using sex as a weapon against female soldiers, usually younger women in their late teens and 20s. You see, unmarried mothers were not allowed in Canada's military. A lot of male soldiers didn't want women in the military in the first place. This created a situation where some male soldiers literally raped women out of the armed forces by getting them pregnant.
That is how I see the laws working, so therefore the social cultural norms would take over, and in those times, women were treated pretty bad in civilian street, and you didn't stand a chance in a more masculine, macho culture called the military.
How was it for lesbians in comparison to other women?
Well, you can look at it as, from one perspective, you were seen as stronger than your heterosexual women counterparts because you're a lesbian, and that's sort of like playing on the tough butch stereotype. So you were kind of respected for that, in a sense. If somebody suspected or thought you might be. So that was an advantage, but it also was a disadvantage in the terms it could be used against you, and you, literally your colleagues, your male colleagues, could blackmail you and often use that as a tool to get sexual favors or something from you. So it was an advantage and a grave disadvantage, because you could be turned in and outed at any time.
How often was that happening, where lesbians became blackmailed by men, male soldiers? Do you have any sense of that?
To tell you the truth, the heterosexual women faced a form of that as well, because in the military, you, as a woman, you walk the tightrope as you're the Virgin Mary or you're a whore. But you're in constant demand to perform for the man.
When you say perform, you mean perform sexual favors?
Perform sexual favors, yeah.
In the 1970s, male and female Canadian soldiers only really interacted socially in their off hours. The environment was sexually charged and fueled by too much cheap alcohol.
Women were walking a tightrope. So lesbians were walking a tightrope. They were seen as stronger because of the stereotype of the butch and the strong lesbian, yet they couldn't challenge or overstep and get in conflict with men being in charge, or the hyper-masculinity, the macho masculinity. So they couldn't overstep that. So on the one hand, you were seen as strong and you were welcomed, but on the other hand, you couldn't overstep it. But still, there was the sexual flavors were still there. The attitude that you were just, I don't want to be crass, but you were just one fuck away from being a heterosexual.
I've heard worse.
Whether it's civilians or men in the military, that's what they would say. Well, you haven't tried a man yet, so how do you know?
I've heard that from a number of women who I've spoken to for this series. Were you a victim of any of that? And we don't have to get into any of the details.
Was I a victim of that? I think all women at one level have been a victim of it. In the military, in various occasions, you're asked to perform and you intuitively try to avoid it before the questions or it actually happens. Never sexually assaulted in terms of the nth degree. Stalking. People come down the hallway and test the door to see if the doors are going to open or not. Because I was away, not at the normal base, so I didn't have anything in the room, and standing on top of a dresser behind the door, and what was I going to do if the person forced the door, if the guy forced the door? So, I've reflected on this a lot. The military has trained me to be highly attuned to my surroundings, especially in surroundings that can be dangerous to me as a woman, and put my life or my security, my physical security, my mental security in terms of men. So they've trained me super well on that. They've trained me not to trust any man.
Public attitudes about gays and lesbians were changing. Why was this still happening? Declassified minutes from a security advisory committee meeting suggest senior bureaucrats were struggling to find ways to continue justifying, excluding, and firing homosexual employees, quote, particularly in view of the demands of human rights groups and gay associations and the publicity given to them, unquote. The Privy Council Office, or PCO, even considered giving guidelines to departments about homosexuals, which were clearer than Cabinet Directive No. 35. When a few departments were asked to comment on the first draft, it ignited resistance in at least one department. While the Department of External Affairs held meetings to prepare its response about employment of homosexuals, it seems, quote, there had been cases when pro-gay representatives had been present with tape recorders, unquote. In April 1977, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau met with a divided cabinet. The cabinet meeting minutes show that the Minister of Supply and Services, Jean-Pierre Goyer of Dollard, Quebec, quote, doubted that homosexuality should continue to be a characteristic that resulted in the exclusion of people from access to secret or top-secret information, unquote, which would exclude them from certain types of jobs. Minister of Justice Ron Basford of Vancouver Centre replied that, quote, any measure directed at regularizing homosexuals' rights would lead to intense political opposition, and he doubted that the government wished to take on that pressure at this time. If, on the other hand, members of the opposition Conservatives were prepared to take the lead on this issue by proposing in Parliament an appropriate amendment to the Human Rights Bill, he thought the government could then re-examine its position, unquote. In the end, the Liberal government of Pierre Trudeau decided that it was in the national interest to allow discrimination based on sexual orientation to continue by purposefully excluding it from the Canadian Human Rights Act. Meanwhile, in Windsor, Ontario, 17-year-old high school grad Patty Gray sailed through the Naval Reserve summer program. She loved wearing the uniform and happened to come out as a lesbian that summer. Patty decided to work for a couple of years. She explored the lesbian dance floors of Detroit, Michigan with her friends and followed her heart into a relationship that she would later have to get out of before her heart got broken.
I just realized I was partying a little too much. I needed to make some changes in my life. So I thought about where can I go? What can I do to make a difference? I thought, well, I did well in the Naval Reserves. Let's sign up for the military. So I went down to the recruiting office. I didn't tell anyone. Went down, took an aptitude test. I could have gone into any field I wanted with the exception of mechanics, which did not surprise me. I wanted to be a military police officer, but because I'd admitted to trying pot, I was unacceptable. So anyway, I took my oath 4 days after my 20th birthday, and I went in September of that year, September of 1979.
Now, when you went in, were you already aware of the military's ban on being gay or lesbian?
I didn't know it was as strict as I came to find out. But at that point, everywhere, you couldn't be out. Like you just couldn't. It's the 70s. You couldn't be out. You couldn't be who you were. It was a dirty little secret that you kept. You lied a lot to your family. You changed pronouns. If you were dating somebody, you changed their name. It was a lot of hiding. It was a lot of undercover, and it was tiring. But I do know people who, got their cars vandalized, people who were beaten up. Gay bashing, was going on back then easily. And the cops didn't really do anything about it. Like, it was like, well, you're queer, or that was a fag. They deserved it. It was really, really horrible attitude. Not a lot of support at all from the authorities.
So within the military then at that time.
Same thing. Well, the military was even stricter. Like it was just known when you went in. You didn't talk about it. If you were smart, you didn't act on it.
That's what Zian Pitre was doing. Now a recluse, she followed her major's order to keep her nose clean, do her job, and stay away from trouble.
I mean, my friends start calling me antisocial. And on the weekend I would go to my mom. When I was there, I wouldn't go to the mess hall. I would go and at Canex buy a piece of ham. I ate so much ham. It's all they sold that I could buy. I would bring that to my room and I would eat, and that lasted for, oh my God, it must have been a good 6 months. My mom could surprise I would go home so often because she used to say I didn't go enough. But one day somebody knocked at my door. Was somebody that lived in the barrack, and she said, "You're coming for supper tonight." I said, "No, I've had supper." "No, you're coming out." She said, "This is enough. You don't associate with people. You're always alone. I don't know if you're shy or what your problem is, but she said, you're coming out." So I did. I went to the mess hall, and my friends just like, "Oh, wow, Mrs. Antisocial, So I went out, and then I started playing sports, and I started, doing all kinds of activity, and I met someone. I mean, you can't hide forever. And I would say about 6 months into the relationship, I'm not sure exactly, she was called in and for the investigation, and she told him yes, that we were in a relationship, and by then it was no more hiding.
That sucks.
And so then it's not her fault. She didn't know, and it was the truth, Sometimes better speak the truth. But so I was released on the 24th of August 1980 after receiving above average, how do you call it?
Appraisals?
Appraisal. And I was going to be accelerated promotions.
I've heard this story a lot. People who were doing really well, or were in your case on an accelerated tracks for promotion, and then these stupid interviews.
I have it my paper here that says very good, you know. And this captain that made it this mission, I guess he wasn't busy enough to follow me around, and so I wouldn't compromise the base, and told me about the promotion and threw it in the garbage. And you know, I still feel today that I should have got that promotion, at least something, before they kicked me out. But 24th of September 1980, I was out. My partner was out in the winter of that year, in February.
What did you end up doing once you were out?
I before I got out, it was hell. I was harassed. I was called names. I went to the mess hall to meet with some friends. I'm always early. It's a bad habit I have. I think it's a military thing where you have to be somewhere 20 minutes before your time. So, yep. So I went in there and I played some pool and pinball, and this guy approached me. We played, bought me a drink, and he drugged me. And he raped me. I woke up the next day, didn't know where I was. He told me that he was showing me what it was to be with a man. I had no clue where I was. And when I finally got home, we had a ball game that morning. And my friend says, "What the hell did you do? Where did you go? We tried to stop you." I said, "What do you mean you tried to stop me?" He said, "You were leaving with this guy and we didn't want you to go because it didn't make no sense for you to do that." And I guess I was rude to them. But I don't remember.
Because you were out of your mind being drugged by something. That's terrible.
No clue. But until I was released, it continued. Then when I was in my apartment and I was not in the military, they get phone calls all the time. People screaming stuff, and young guys, you know.
How long was it from the time they were telling you you were out until you actually left?
It wasn't that long for me. Probably a couple of months. Just enough to harass me, make you crazy almost.
What you just said there, enough time to harass you, that seems like I've heard that a lot. You know, folks get identified, they're getting thrown out. It was like, if you're such a security risk, why the hell are you allowed to stay on the job for 2-3 weeks, a month, 2 months, getting harassed by all these people? Like, wouldn't you just be fired and get out?
I mean, I remember the last investigation, I said, "What is it you want me to say about to be a security risk? What kind of pencil we use? I'm a supply technician. I don't work in any area that involves any confidential material in that." And I remember saying to him, "I worked as an airframe technician in Chatham. I'm more of a risk outside of the military than inside the military."
While Diane was in the fight of her life, it wasn't long before Patty Gray felt she was in danger herself.
When it started on our base, I was in Chatham, New Brunswick, which is where I got posted after I was done my basic training from Cornwallis and my trades training in Borden, Ontario. I was in Chatham, and it was the fourth smallest base in Canada, and I found out quickly that there was two types of women on the base. If you were dating a guy, you were a slut. If you weren't, you were a dyke. And I don't know, there didn't seem to be any gray area.
What could you try and clear that up for me? I have many questions, it's like the cartoons right now. I've got those question marks above my head going, what?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Only two type of women on the base?
Well, that seemed to be the general thought. When the investigation was going on in our base, I found out later, they called in every single woman on our base who was single, who was not in a known relationship with a man, was called in and questioned. And in some cases, it's like, "Well, I'm straight. Well, prove it." And it happened on other bases. So it wasn't just lesbians and gay men that were being affected. It was straight people. If you happened to be friends with us, if you were an ally, whether or not you knew we were gay, you were being called in and questioned, especially if you played on a women's, for example, the women's fastball team. You go away for a weekend tournament. Who stayed with who and whose room, and who do you think's together? And it happened to a lot of straight women who were called in, and they were questioned and they were harassed as well.
It turns out that a lot of Canadians were being harassed back then. By the late 1970s, the RCMP Security Services maintained a name index that had 1,300,000 entries. That represented 800,000 files on individual Canadians. Not all homosexuals, but that gives you a sense of the size of RCMP operations. Operations that the 1979 Royal Commission of Inquiry into certain illegal activities of the RCMP warned about strongly. Quote, "We believe that controls are needed to prevent a security intelligence agency from maintaining files on thousands of people who are not threats or potential threats to the security of Canada. There is little doubt that some of this information might be useful at some point in the future, but we believe that the risk of abuse in collecting information on so broad a category of people, as demonstrated by the Security Service's long-standing program of collecting information on homosexuals, is far greater. The government would have no way of properly defining what the agency should and should not collect. The result would likely be a security intelligence agency which was intruding far too much into the lives of Canadians." Unquote. The Commission recommended that the existing security service files on homosexuals be reviewed and those which do not fall within the guidelines for opening and maintaining files on individuals be destroyed. The fact that the investigations weren't stopped years before was a striking illustration of an insensitivity about what the security service ought to be securing, wrote the commissioners. The Canadian Human Rights Commission recommended that sexual orientation be added to the Canadian Human Rights Act in 1979. In fact, a public opinion poll by the Commission found that 68% of Canadians thought self-acknowledged homosexuals with superior qualifications should be admitted to the RCMP Security Service. When asked to comment on the Human Rights Commission's poll results showing a strong majority of Canadians supporting hiring homosexuals, RCMP Superintendent John Bentham told the Ottawa Journal, quote, "To this point, we haven't found any overwhelming public support for hiring homosexuals," unquote. Also in 1979, a young new member of Parliament took his seat, not yet known to the public for his true self. At the age of 27, he was among the youngest ever elected to Canada's House of Commons. This trailblazing figure was none other than Sven Robinson. Next time on Queer Legends and Oral History Podcast, Canada's Parliament took its first steps towards equality.
We tabled our report and it landed like a bomb in the Conservative caucus. There was huge anger from the dinosaur wing of the Conservative caucus.
That's how it landed at the RCMP and National Defence Headquarters too, with no end to the Government of Canada's queer witch hunt in sight.
And it felt like, you could tell like it's as if everybody's watching, like there's another fag going out the door or something. But they literally took me to the front door of National Defence Headquarters. They threw me out onto the street, literally.
I said to them, what do you want from me? And they said, we want the truth. And I said, okay, I'm going to give you the truth. I don't know. I don't know if I'm gay. I don't know if I'm straight. I know I'm in the army. I know I'm really good at it, but I don't know the rest.
You'll hear the rest in our next episode. Thank you for listening. Queer Legends and Oral History Podcast is a production of Secret Agents. This episode was researched, written, recorded, and technically produced by Sean Dern. Very special thanks go to Glenn Crawford and to the Bank Street Business Improvement Area's Village Legacy Project in Ottawa for sharing their recording of Charlie Hill with us. Gary Bennett's audio is courtesy of Dr. Andrew Birch at the Canadian War Museum. The executive producer of Queer Legends is Ian Capstick. Season 2 is supported in part through a community grant from the LGBT Purge Fund. If you enjoy Queer Legends, don't forget to give us 5 stars and a great review wherever you happen to be listening right now. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, YouTube, and wherever else you go for great storytelling.